This video is audio content only. It does not contain any video footage or images. If you are expecting visual content, please be aware. This is intentionally provided in an audio-only format. We recommend listening to the audio rather than watching the screen. Thank you for your understanding. Welcome to our exploration of the black-headed people, the Sumerians. Long buried beneath the Mesopotamian sands, this enigmatic civilization laid the very foundations of modern life. Today, we'll unravel the Sumerian problem of their mysterious origins, witness the birth of the first cities, and explore the revolutionary inventions, from writing to the 60-minute hour, that still shape our world. From the Epic of Gilgamesh to the dramatic rediscovery of their lost empires, join us as we journey back 5,000 years to meet the architects of civilization. Chapter 1: The Linguistic Puzzle and the Mystery of Sumerian Origins. The story of the Sumerians begins in a landscape of extremes, a region of southern Mesopotamia that today forms the sun-drenched marshes and arid plains of southern Iraq and parts of Kuwait. This was a land tucked between two temperamental titans, the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. To the ancient world, this area was known as the Fertile Crescent, a sliver of life-sustaining soil surrounded by the vastness of the Arabian desert and the rugged peaks of the Taurus and Zagros mountains. Yet, for all its eventual fame as the cradle of civilization, the people who first built its cities remained entirely forgotten by history for thousands of years. Their name, their language, and their very existence were buried under meters of river silt and sand until the early modern era, when travelers like Pietro della Valle in 1616 and Claudius James Rich in the early 19th century began to document the strange, massive earth mounds known as tells that dot the Iraqi landscape. The people we now call the Sumerians did not use that name for themselves. In their own tongue, they were the Sag Giga, a term that translates literally as the black-headed people. Their land was known as Kengir, or the land of the noble lords, and their language was Emegir. The name Sumer is actually an external label, a corruption of the word Shumeru used by their northern neighbors, the Akkadians, to describe the southern region. For the Akkadians, Sumer meant the land of the civilized kings. This distinction between the northern and southern reaches of Mesopotamia is fundamental to understanding the mystery of who these people were. While the northern populations spoke Semitic languages related to modern Arabic and Hebrew, the Sumerians spoke a language that was unlike anything else heard in the ancient Near East. This linguistic isolation is the heart of what scholars have long called the Sumerian problem. In the study of linguistics, Emegir is classified as a language isolate. This means it has no known relatives, living or dead. It is not related to the Indo-European languages that moved across Europe and India, nor is it part of the Semitic family that dominated the surrounding deserts. It is a unique agglutinative language, characterized by the way it glues together unchanging syllables to form complex words and sentences. For example, a single verbal compound could carry the meaning of an entire sentence in English. This linguistic uniqueness has led researchers to search far and wide for potential cousins, attempting to link Sumerian to languages as diverse as Basque in the Pyrenees, Georgian in the Caucasus, the Chukchi language of eastern Siberia, and the Dravidian languages of southern India. Despite these efforts, the Sumerian tongue remains a solitary island in the sea of human speech. The mystery of their origin only deepens when one considers the Sumerians' own accounts of their history. The Sumerian King List, a remarkable cuneiform document that blends history with myth, suggests a timeline that defies modern understanding. It records the names of antediluvian kings who ruled for periods that seem impossible to the modern mind. The first king, Alulim, is said to have ruled in the city of Eridu for 28,800 years, while other versions of the list suggest reigns as long as 43,200 years. These figures, while clearly symbolic, emphasize the Sumerians' belief in their own immense antiquity and the divine nature of their origins. They did not see themselves as a people who had slowly evolved from local tribes, but as a civilization whose structure was established by the gods themselves in the deepest reaches of time. One theory regarding their origin suggests that the Sumerians were migrants who descended from the Zagros Mountains to the northeast in modern-day Iran. Proponents of this view point to the Sumerian word for homeland, Kur, which also means mountain. They argue that the Sumerians' habit of building their temples on elevated platforms was an attempt to recreate the mountainous landscape of their original home in the flat, muddy plains of the south. Furthermore, early Sumerian artwork often depicts animals and trees native to mountain highlands, such as the ibex and the cedar, rather than the water buffalo and reeds of the Mesopotamian marshes. Some researchers have noted that early Sumerian sculptures often depict people with rounder faces and distinct physical features that differ from the more angular profiles of their Semitic neighbors, leading to theories of a migration from Central Asia or the Caucasus. Another compelling theory looks toward the sea. Some researchers believe the Sumerians may have arrived by boat from the south, perhaps from the region of the Persian Gulf, or even as far away as the Indus Valley. This theory is supported by Sumerian mythology, which claims that the elements of civilization were brought to the city of Eridu by a mysterious being named Oannes. According to the Babylonian priest Berossus, who recorded these legends in the 3rd century BCE, Oannes was a creature with the body of a fish, but with a human head beneath the fish's head, and human feet attached to the fish's tail. Oannes supposedly emerged from the Erythraean Sea to teach the people the foundations of letters, sciences, and every kind of art. The Sumerians themselves spoke of a place called Dilmun, a pure, bright land where the gods lived and where death did not exist, leading some to wonder if this was a cultural memory of a maritime ancestral home. However, a different perspective has gained ground in recent decades, suggesting that the Sumerians may have been indigenous to the region all along. This theory argues that the Sumerians were the result of a long, slow process of cultural evolution and the merging of different groups who had lived in the river valleys for millennia. Long before the first Sumerian city was built, the land was inhabited by a people archaeologists call the Ubaidiyans. These early settlers were the true pioneers of the region, establishing the first modest shrines that would later evolve into the massive temple complexes of the Sumerian era. Many of the most famous Sumerian cities, including Uruk, and Eridu, actually have names that are not Sumerian in origin, suggesting they were founded by these earlier inhabitants. Crucial evidence for this indigenous theory has emerged from modern science. Genetic studies of the marsh Arabs, or Madan, who live in the southern Iraqi marshes today, suggest a deep ancestral link to the ancient inhabitants of the region. These studies indicate that the marsh Arabs possess a unique genetic signature that has remained relatively stable for thousands of years, suggesting they are the closest living relatives to the Sumerians. This genetic continuity implies that the black-headed people did not arrive as a sudden wave of conquerors, but were the descendants of the prehistoric populations who had mastered the unique environment of the Mesopotamian delta. This suggests that the Sumerians were perhaps an amalgamation of various groups, some from the mountains, some from the sea, and some who had always been there, who converged in the fertile river valleys. Over many centuries, these different groups likely adopted a common culture and the unique Amigir language, creating a rich tapestry of integration. They were a people who appeared on the stage of history possessing a level of sophistication that seemed to leap out of the Stone Age, yet their roots were firmly planted in the mud of the Tigris and Euphrates. By approximately 4000 BCE, at the start of the Uruk period, they had firmly established themselves as the dominant force in the region, ready to transform the way humans interacted with the world. The Sumerian problem may never be fully solved to the satisfaction of every researcher. The origins of the black-headed people remain shrouded in the mists of prehistory, and their language continues to stand alone as a linguistic mystery. Yet the evidence of their impact is undeniable. They were the people who took the raw materials of mud and water and transformed them into the world's first metropolises. Their legacy was not just in the bricks they laid, but in the very idea that human beings could organize themselves into a complex, stable society. As the small farming villages of the Ubaid period began to grow and coalesce, they set the stage for a new era of human existence. The transition from the simple, rural life of the Neolithic age to the fast-paced, administrative world of the city was about to begin in earnest, raising the question of how these mysterious people would use their unique talents to master the very elements of time and space. Chapter 2: The Architects of Time and the Urban Revolution. The Sumerians were a people who looked at the raw, chaotic elements of the natural world and saw the potential for a meticulous, structured order. In the absence of timber, stone, or precious metals, they turned to the one substance they possessed in abundance, the thick, gray mud of the Mesopotamian riverbanks. From this humble material, they did not merely build shelters, they constructed the very framework of modern existence. Their genius was rooted in an extraordinary flair for organization and a psychological drive for success and prestige. This ambition manifested most clearly in their transformation of the landscape through the invention of the city and the mastery of time itself. To understand the Sumerian world, one must first understand their relationship with time. While other cultures might have been content to mark the passing of seasons or the rising of the sun, the Sumerians sought to divide the day into precise, manageable units. They essentially invented time as a structured concept by developing a sexagesimal numbering system, which is a base 60 structure. This choice was not accidental. The number 60 is incredibly versatile, being divisible by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30. Because of this mathematical efficiency, they divided the day and night into 12-hour periods, and then further divided those hours into 60 minutes and those minutes into 60 seconds. Every time a person in the modern world looks at a clock or navigates using the 360 degrees of a compass, they are utilizing a system designed by the black-headed people 5,000 years ago. This obsession with measurement and calculation extended to every facet of their lives. In the city of Shuruppak, archaeologists discovered a clay tablet dating to the 27th century BCE that serves as the oldest known mathematical text. It is not a practical ledger for trade, but rather a table of pure mathematics showing the areas of 6 rectangles where the length is 60 times greater than the width. This suggests that the Sumerians valued mathematical inquiry for its own sake, laying the groundwork for arithmetic and geometry. They developed multiplication tables, calculated square and cube roots, and found the area of triangles and the volume of cubes. These were the tools they needed to survey the land, allot fields to farmers, and manage the massive labor forces required for their grandest projects. The most visible result of this organizational genius was the rise of the city. Following the start of the Uruk period around 4000 BCE, southern Mesopotamia experienced what researchers call an urban implosion. Populations that had been scattered across the countryside were drawn, almost as if by a centripetal force, into massive urban centers. This was not merely a migration of convenience, it was driven by the temple magnet theory. The growth of the temple complex as a center of redistribution and divine protection preceded and actively caused the growth of the city around it. Uruk, the most prominent of these, became the first true metropolis in human history. At its height, it boasted a population of between 40,000 and 80,000 people living within 6 miles of defensive walls. To put this in perspective, Uruk was the largest city in the world at a time when the total human population was a mere fraction of what it is today. Life in a Sumerian city was a sensory experience of heat, dust, and constant activity. The streets were narrow and crowded, often laid out on a sophisticated grid system that predates the urban planning of the Romans and Greeks. Houses were built of mud bricks, which were formed by mixing mud with straw and drying them in the sun. The Sumerians were the first to realize that the naturally occurring tar, or bitumen, found in the marshes could be used as a powerful adhesive and waterproofing agent. They used bitumen as a mortar for bricks and to seal the hulls of their reed boats. They also pioneered the use of the arched doorway, an architectural breakthrough that allowed for stronger entrances and more complex interior spaces. These thick walls provided excellent insulation, keeping the interiors cool during the brutal summer months. Residents often lived their lives on the flat roofs of their homes, using the elevated space for working, cooking, or sleeping in the cooler night air. The ziggurat was the heart and soul of the Sumerian city. Unlike the Egyptian pyramids, which were designed as tombs with internal passages, the ziggurat was a towering stepped platform made of solid mud brick with no inner chambers. At the very top stood a sanctuary, a small temple where the patron deity of the city was believed to dwell. The ziggurat of constructed around 2100 BCE, remains one of the most iconic examples of this architecture. It was a three-storied structure that stood nearly 50 feet high, designed as a literal stairway to heaven. The Sumerians believed that their gods lived in these high places, and the ziggurat served as a point of contact between the divine and the terrestrial. Access to the top was strictly controlled by the priesthood, who performed rituals to ensure the city's prosperity. The construction of such massive buildings required a revolution in manufacturing. The Sumerians were the first to move beyond hand-shaping clay to using molds for making bricks. This allowed them to produce building materials on an industrial scale. While sun-dried bricks were sufficient for most homes, they were vulnerable to the rains and the periodic flooding of the rivers. To solve this, the Sumerians developed the kiln, allowing them to fire bricks at high temperatures to create a much more durable, weather-resistant material. These kiln-fired bricks were often used to face the exterior of ziggurats and palaces, ensuring that the monuments of the kings and gods would endure for centuries. Feeding an urban population of tens of thousands in an arid environment required an equally revolutionary approach to agriculture. The Sumerians were the first to master hydraulic engineering. They realized that the Tigris and Euphrates rivers carried nutrient-rich silt that could turn the desert into an oasis. They constructed a complex network of canals, levees, and reservoirs to capture the spring floods and store the water for use during the long, dry summer. This was not a simple task. The silt that made the land fertile also threatened to clog the canals. Managing these waterways required constant maintenance and a centralized authority to oversee the labor. The Sumerian Farmer's Almanac, a clay document discovered by archaeologists, provides a detailed look at their agricultural sophistication. It contains instructions for every stage of the farming process, from the preparation of the field to the final harvest. It describes the use of the cedar plow, a device that allowed farmers to till the soil and drop seeds into the furrow at the same time, significantly increasing efficiency. The almanac even includes specific spiritual instructions, such as the prayer to Ninkalim, the goddess of field rodents, to protect the grain from being eaten. This surplus of food, created through large-scale irrigation and the use of beasts of burden like oxen, was the foundation of their civilization. It freed a large portion of the population from the necessity of food production, allowing for the emergence of specialized classes: architects, scribes, metalworkers, and merchants. This specialization led to the birth of the first factories. In the temple complexes, the Sumerians organized large-scale textile production, weaving wool into fabric on an industrial level. They were the first to cross kin lines to form these working organizations, which were the direct predecessors of modern manufacturing companies. Similarly, the invention of the pottery wheel around 3500 BCE allowed for the mass production of ceramic vessels. This was the first device to allow for mass production, effectively creating the ancient forerunner of Tupperware. One of the most common artifacts found in Sumerian ruins is the beveled rim bowl. These were crude, undecorated containers made in standard sizes, which researchers believe were used to distribute fixed rations of grain or beer to workers. As the economy grew, the Sumerians introduced the shekel, the world's first uniform currency. Originally, a shekel was not a coin, but a specific weight of barley, which eventually transitioned into a weight of silver. This standardization allowed for the first system of temple loans, where citizens could borrow capital to start businesses or manage harvests, creating a sophisticated financial ecosystem. The Sumerians were energetic traders, traveling overland by donkey caravan or by sea in sailboats they had invented. They traded their textiles and grain for the timber, stone, and metals they lacked, reaching as far as Anatolia, the Indus Valley, and the island of Delman. This long-distance commerce made the invention of writing a logistical necessity. It began around 3400 BCE with the use of small clay tokens of various shapes representing specific quantities of goods, such as a cone for a small measure of grain or a sphere for a larger amount. These tokens were sometimes enclosed in hollow clay spheres called bullae, which were marked on the outside with seals to guarantee the contents. Eventually, administrators realized they could skip the tokens and simply press the shapes directly into flat clay tablets. These initial marks were pictograms, simple drawings of the objects being tracked. Over centuries, these pictures became more abstract, evolving into the wedge-shaped script we know as cuneiform. Scribes used a sharpened reed stylus to press symbols into wet clay, which was then baked or dried in the sun to create a permanent record. Cuneiform was an incredibly flexible system. It could represent whole words, abstract ideas, or phonetic syllables. To ensure a steady supply of trained record keepers, the Sumerians established the world's first formal schooling system. These schools, known as the eduba or tablet house, were usually attached to temples. The curriculum was rigorous and often enforced with strict discipline. Students spent years mastering the thousands of cuneiform signs, practicing by copying lists of words, proverbs, and legal documents. Excavations have uncovered tablets with a teacher's neat handwriting on one side and a student's clumsy attempt to copy it on the other. While the eduba was primarily attended by boys from wealthy families, literacy was not exclusively male. High priestesses and royal daughters were highly educated, and women's literacy was essential for the administration of the great temple households. These schools were the first mass effort to pass along knowledge systematically, ensuring that the society could continue to build upon its own achievements. The Sumerians were also the first to use copper on a wide scale, mixing it with tin to create bronze around 3500 BCE. This harder metal allowed for the creation of superior tools and weapons. Their metallurgists used furnaces heated by reeds, controlling the temperature with bellows worked by hand or foot. This technological edge was applied to transportation through the development of the two-wheeled chariot. To pull these vehicles, the Sumerians bred a unique hybrid animal known as the kunga. Long before horses were common in Mesopotamia, the Sumerians bred domestic donkeys with wild asses to produce an animal that was faster and stronger than a donkey, but more controllable than a wild ass. These kungas were so highly valued that they were given as gifts to royalty and are depicted in Sumerian artwork pulling the chariots of kings. The Sumerian city was a complex machine governed by a sophisticated administrative hierarchy. At the top was the ruler, assisted by a council of elders that included both men and women. This early form of government gave rise to the first bicameral Congress, a system with two legislative chambers, an upper house of elders and a lower house of military-aged men that is still used by many modern nations today. Their organizational genius extended to the first case of tax reduction, recorded as a royal decree to ease the economic burden on the citizenry, and even the first known aquarium, where fish were kept for study or display. The Sumerians took the basic needs of survival and turned them into a series of interconnected systems. They created the first libraries to house their records, the first legal codes to govern their behavior, and the first sewage systems to manage the waste of their large populations. They even found time for leisure, inventing board games like the royal game of and brewing beer as a dietary staple. In Sumer, beer was considered a gift from the gods, brewed in large vats and consumed through special straws to filter out the grain residue. By organizing themselves into city-states, they created the blueprint for every civilization that followed. They were the architects of the first metropolises, the masters of the first written language, and the first people to look at the stars and see a map of time. This new urban reality, however, was not just a feat of engineering. It was a deeply spiritual endeavor, rooted in a complex relationship with the powerful and unpredictable forces they believed governed their lives. The transition from the scattered villages of the Ubaid period to the sprawling administrative powerhouses of the Uruk period was complete, but the black-headed people now faced the challenge of maintaining the favor of the gods who had granted them these gifts. Chapter 3: The Seven Who Decree and the Great Below. To the Sumerian mind, the universe was not a collection of random physical laws, but a carefully constructed, living machine, envisioned as a great dome resting upon a flat disk. This disk, the Earth, was entirely surrounded by a primordial, eternal saltwater sea known as Namu. Beneath the Earth lay a vast freshwater ocean called the Abzu, the domain of the god of wisdom. Above the Earth, the sky was a series of domes made of precious stones, where the holy stars resided and the gods held court. This was a world where every rustle of wind, every flash of lightning, and every sudden flood was a direct manifestation of a divine will. In their own tongue, Emagir, the Sumerians described themselves as the humble caretakers of this landscape, created for the sole purpose of laboring so that the gods could rest. This relationship between the human and the divine was defined by a sense of absolute dependence and a persistent anxiety. The gods of Sumer were not distant, abstract entities. They were anthropomorphic, possessing human forms, human emotions, and all too human tempers. They could be kind and generous, but they were also mercurial and capable of devastating violence. The unpredictable flooding of the Tigris and Euphrates was interpreted as the direct and terrifying anger of Enlil, the god of the air. The role of the Sumerian person was to appease these powerful beings through constant service, ritual, and sacrifice. Failure to do so meant inviting disaster, drought, plague, or the terrifying wrath of the storm. At the center of this spiritual world was a pantheon of thousands of deities, but the Sumerians recognized a core group of 7 who decree the fates of all things. At the very top was An, the god of the heavens, the distant patriarchal figurehead of the universe. However, the most active and powerful figure in daily life was Enlil, the king of the gods and lord of the ghostland, whose seat of power was the city of Nippur. Nippur served as the cosmological mooring post of heaven and earth, where the divine assembly met to decide the future of mankind. While Enlil represented the unpredictable power of the atmosphere, Enki, the god of water and wisdom, was seen as the true friend of humanity. Residing in the Abzu beneath his sacred city of Eridu, Enki was the master of crafts and the great healer. Alongside them stood Ninhursag, the mother goddess and the personification of the earth's fertility, who was believed to have given form to the first humans. The feminine divine was also embodied by Inanna, the goddess of love and warfare, whose contradictions made her both a source of life and a bringer of destruction. The group of 7 was completed by Ut, the sun god, who presided over justice and saw all crimes committed under the light of day, and Nana, also known as Sin, the moon god, whose wisdom governed the passage of months and the cycles of the natural world. The Sumerians believed that all the rules of civilization, known as the me, were physical objects, divine decrees that had to be possessed and performed to maintain order. These me covered everything from the office of the priesthood and the art of kingship to specific skills like the art of metalworking, the kindling of fire, and even the ritual of the descent into the underworld. In one famous myth, Inanna travels to Eridu to visit her father, Enki. She gets him drunk and tricks him into giving her over 100 of these sacred me, which she then carries back to her city of Uruk in a boat of heaven. For the Sumerians, the physical possession of this divine knowledge was what made a city great and its culture legitimate. The temple was the physical manifestation of this divine presence. Known in Emigir as the or household, the temple was the literal residence of the god, who lived within a cult statue that was treated as a living person. Priests and temple staff prepared daily meals for the statue, bathed it, and even put it to bed at night. These households of the gods were the recipients of the most prestigious gifts, including the kunga. The ziggurats served as a point of contact where the human and divine worlds could meet. The citizens were considered the servant slaves of the patron deity, and a portion of everything.
Chapter 4. The Rise of the Lugal and the Akkadian Eclipse.
As the cities of southern Mesopotamia grew in size and complexity, the nature of leadership underwent a fundamental transformation. In the earliest days of Sumerian urbanization, the city-states were essentially theocracies. The highest authority was the or high priest, who resided within the temple complex. This leader was responsible for both the spiritual health of the community and the administrative management of its resources. The temple was the storehouse, the bank, and the social center, and the was the steward of the city's patron deity. However, as the population expanded and the competition for arable land and water rights intensified, a new type of leader began to emerge from the shadow of the ziggurat. This transition marks the beginning of the early dynastic period, a time stretching from approximately 2900 to 2334 BCE. During these centuries, the primary seat of power shifted from the temple to the royal palace. This shift is physically represented in the archaeological record by the Temple Oval at Kafaja, where a massive fortified wall began to separate the sacred precinct from the burgeoning secular and residential districts, signaling a new era of social stratification. The title of Ensi, or priestly governor, was increasingly eclipsed by that of the Lugal. Etymologically, Lugal translates to big man, a term suggesting a leader whose authority was rooted in physical prowess, military success, and the ability to command large numbers of people in times of crisis. While the Lugal still claimed a divine mandate, his role was more secular, focused on the defense and expansion of the city-state. The landscape of Sumer became a patchwork of these independent city-states, each surrounded by massive defensive walls. This was an era of near-constant warfare, as cities like Uruk, Kish, and Lagash fought over the precious silt-laden waters of the Tigris and Euphrates. As recorded in the Sumerian king list, hegemony, the right to rule over the other cities, passed from one dynasty to another, often following a military defeat, beginning with Kish. The first dynasty of Kish is notable for producing the first historical personality whose name is recorded in authentic inscriptions, Enmebaragesi. Ruling around 2700 BCE, he is credited with leading the Sumerians in the first recorded war in history, a conflict against the neighboring land of Elam to the east. The Sumerians were victorious, and Enmebaragesi returned to build the temple of Enlil at Nippur, further cementing that city's status as a pan-Sumerian religious hub. His successor, Aga, is famously remembered for his siege of the city of Uruk, an event that brings us to the most celebrated figure in all of Mesopotamian history.
Gilgamesh, the fifth king of the first dynasty of Uruk, is a figure who straddles the line between history and myth. While the Epic of Gilgamesh portrays him as a demigod, inscriptions suggest he was a real ruler who reigned around 2700 BCE. He is credited with the construction of Uruk's massive defensive walls and the restoration of sacred sites. While he honored various deities, the primary patron of Uruk remained Inanna, whose temple, the Eanna, served as the city's spiritual heart. The conflict between Aga of Kish and Gilgamesh of Uruk, described in Sumerian poetry, illustrates the shifting power dynamics of the age. When Aga's fleet arrived at Uruk to demand submission, Gilgamesh chose to fight, eventually winning Uruk's independence and establishing its dominance in the region. As the early dynastic period progressed, the wealth and sophistication of these city-states reached new heights. The city of situated near the mouth of the Euphrates, became a dominant maritime port, controlling the trade routes that flowed through the Persian Gulf. The political power of Ur's rulers was absolute, a fact reflected in the grim reality of the royal cemetery. In the Great Death Pit, 74 individuals, 6 men and 68 women, were found laid out in neat rows. These attendants were sacrificed to serve their elite masters in the afterlife, a stark testament to the terrifying degree of control the Lugals exerted over their subjects. This period also saw the unique reign of Kubaba, a woman who had allegedly been a tavern keeper before seizing the throne of Kish. She is the only female monarch named in the Sumerian king list, and she is credited with making firm the foundations of her city and forging a dynasty that lasted a century.
One of the most detailed accounts of Sumerian warfare and politics comes from the city-state of Lagash and its long-running rivalry with the neighboring city of Umma. For generations, these two cities contested the possession of the Guidena, a fertile region of agricultural land that lay between them. Around 2450 BCE, King Eannatum of Lagash launched a military campaign to settle the dispute. He managed to annex practically all of Sumer, creating one of the first verifiable empires in history. However, Eannatum's rise was marked by a darker side of statecraft. Historical records suggest he used terror as a matter of policy to maintain his grip on conquered territories. To commemorate his victory over Umma, he commissioned the Stele of the Vultures, a limestone monument that depicts his troops marching in a phalanx formation, trampling the bodies of their enemies while vultures peck at severed heads. The Stele of the Vultures is a landmark in military history, providing the earliest evidence of the phalanx, a formation where soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder with overlapping shields and leveled spears. This tactical advancement, combined with the use of war chariots pulled by onagers, gave the Sumerian armies a significant edge. Eannatum's empire, however, collapsed shortly after his death as the city-states returned to their habitual infighting. It was during this time of internal strife that the city of Lagash saw the reign of Uruk-agina, a king who was remembered for his social reforms. He published a series of decrees aimed at protecting the poor from the abuses of the wealthy and the priesthood, marking the first recorded attempt to establish social justice through law. The era of independent Sumerian city-states finally came to an end with the rise of a man who would fundamentally change the course of human history. Sargon of Akkad, a Semitic-speaking leader from northern Mesopotamia, claims to have been the son of a priestess and a gardener. Around 2334 BCE, he overthrew the king of Kish and launched a series of military campaigns that brought all of Sumer under his control. He defeated the last ethnically Sumerian king, Lugal of Umma, who had briefly united the region. In a final act of public humiliation, Sargon led the defeated Lugal in a neck yoke to the gates of the temple of Enlil at Nippur, signaling that the gods had transferred their favor to the Akkadians. Sargon founded the Akkadian Empire, the world's first true multinational empire. His rule extended from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea and into the mountains of Turkey and Iran. To maintain control over his vast territories, Sargon implemented a revolutionary administrative system. He broke the traditional power of the local Sumerian elites by placing trusted Akkadian officials in powerful positions in every city, ensuring that the local administration remained loyal to the crown. One of his most effective strategies was the appointment of his daughter, Enheduanna, as the high priestess of the moon god Nana at Enheduanna was not just a religious figure. She was a brilliant poet and is recognized today as the world's first author known by name.
Her hymns to the goddess Inanna helped to synchronize Sumerian and Akkadian religious beliefs, creating a cultural symbiosis that would endure for centuries. The Akkadian Empire introduced a new concept of kingship. Sargon and his successors, most notably his grandson Naram-Sin, claimed divinity, prefixing their names with the symbol for a god and calling themselves the king of the four corners of the universe. This was a departure from the Sumerian ideal of the shepherd king who served the people. The Akkadian rulers were absolute autocrats whose power was maintained through military force and an extensive bureaucracy. However, the empire was plagued by internal rebellions and external threats. Around 2154 BCE, the Akkadian capital of Akkad was destroyed by the Gutians, a semi-nomadic group of mountain people from the Zagros Mountains whom the Sumerians described as barbarians with human feelings but canine intelligence. The Gutian period is often viewed as a dark age in Mesopotamian history, a time of chaos where the sophisticated systems of administration were neglected. Yet the Gutians were not entirely immune to the culture they conquered. Over time, they adopted many Akkadian customs and the Akkadian language, creating a bridge that allowed Sumerian culture to survive the occupation. During this time, the city of Lagash, under its ruler Gudea, experienced an artistic and architectural renaissance. Gudea's numerous statues depict him in a specific shepherd's hat, a detail that reinforced the traditional Sumerian ideal of the pious and humble servant of the gods. He focused his energies on building temples and restoring the religious traditions of his people, providing a stark contrast to the self-deified kings of the Akkadian era. The final flourish of Sumerian political power began around 2112 BCE with the rise of the Third Dynasty of a period often called the Sumerian Renaissance. This era was spearheaded by Namu and his son Shulgi, who succeeded in driving out the Gutians and reuniting Sumer and Akkad. Namu was a visionary leader who sought to return to the orderly administrative traditions of the past. He is credited with building the Great Ziggurat of and publishing the Code of Namu, the oldest known law code. Unlike later Babylonian laws that emphasized eye for an eye retribution, Namu's code focused on monetary compensation for bodily injuries, reflecting a more nuanced approach to justice. Under Shulgi, who reigned for nearly 50 years, the Sumerian state reached its bureaucratic zenith. He implemented widespread administrative reforms, creating a highly centralized government that managed every aspect of the economy. He established a unified curriculum for the training of scribes in the Edaba and created a standardized system of weights and measures to facilitate trade. The Third Dynasty of was a time of immense prosperity, fueled by the industrial-scale production of textiles and the meticulous record-keeping of temple assets. Shulgi even revived the practice of royal deification, presenting himself as a heroic protector of his people. Despite this outward appearance of strength, the Sumerian Renaissance was built on fragile foundations. The region was becoming increasingly Semitic, as waves of Amorite migrants from the western deserts moved into the river valleys. The end came around 2004 BCE during the reign of Ibisin, the last king of the Third Dynasty of The city of was invaded and sacked by the Elamites, while the Amorites seized control of other major cities. The Sumerians, as a cohesive political entity, ceased to exist. The language of the black-headed people was gradually replaced by Akkadian in daily life, and the once mighty city-states were absorbed into the rising powers of Babylonia and Assyria. As the political light of Sumer faded, the question remained: would the cultural and intellectual achievements of the black-headed people survive the death of their nation? Chapter 5: The Resurrection of the Black-Headed People. The decline of the Sumerian people was a slow attrition of the land itself. While the political end of Sumer is marked by the fall of the Third Dynasty of around 2004 BCE, the true death of the civilization occurred as soil salinization compromised the agricultural productivity of the heartland.
This ecological shift permanently moved the balance of power to the north, and the Sumerians were slowly absorbed into the rising tide of Semitic cultures. By approximately 1800 BCE, Sumerian was no longer a living vernacular. It transitioned into a prestigious liturgical tongue, preserved in the Aduba as the Latin of the ancient world. Scribes maintained a specific dialect known as Emesal, used specifically for hymns and incantations, ensuring that the voices of the black-headed people echoed in temples for nearly 2,000 years after their last king had fallen. The final gasps of the language occurred during the Hellenistic period, with the last known Sumerian document, an astronomical text, dating to the 1st century CE. After that, the script was forgotten, and the memory of the Sumerian people vanished for nearly 2 millennia. The world remained ignorant of the civilization that had invented the city and the division of time until the 19th century, when European explorers began documenting the massive earth mounds of southern Iraq. The resurrection of this forgotten civilization began with the decipherment of cuneiform, a process that relied on the Behistun inscription in modern-day Iran. This massive monument, carved by the Persian king Darius the Great, served as the Rosetta Stone for the ancient Near East. It contained identical text in 3 different languages: Old Persian, Elamite, and Akkadian. In 1838, British officer Henry Rawlinson copied these inscriptions using his knowledge of modern Persian to crack the Old Persian section. This provided the leverage needed to begin deciphering the Akkadian portion. As scholars like Rawlinson and the Reverend Edward Hincks worked on the Akkadian texts, they realized the cuneiform script did not fit the Semitic language. The signs often represented syllables or objects unrelated to Semitic roots, suggesting the script had been invented by an older, non-Semitic people. In 1857, the Royal Asiatic Society staged a pivotal experiment to prove that cuneiform had been successfully deciphered. They gave a newly discovered inscription to 4 scholars, Rawlinson, Hincks, Julius Oppert, and William Henry Fox Talbot, to translate independently. Their nearly identical results proved to the world that the ancient script was no longer a mystery. In 1869, Oppert officially coined the name Sumerian for this lost language, identifying it through the royal title King of Sumer and Akkad. This proposal sparked the acrimonious debate known as the Sumerian problem. The debate was only settled by the spade. In 1877, the French consul Ernest de Sarzec began excavating Tello, the ancient city of Girsu, where he discovered the diorite statues of the ruler Gudea. These statues, covered in Sumerian inscriptions regarding royal decrees and prayers, proved that the Sumerians were a real flesh-and-blood people who possessed a highly developed culture long before the rise of Babylon. Following the success at Tello, international teams uncovered the staggering depth of the Sumerian legacy. Excavations at Nippur by the University of Pennsylvania revealed tens of thousands of tablets, including the first library catalog and the first pharmacopoeia. At Shuruppak, archaeologists found the oldest known school texts and the world's oldest musically notated song, known as Hurrian Hymn No. 6. These discoveries replaced generic myths with specific historical firsts, including the first legal precedents and the first animal fables. In 1922, Sir Leonard Woolley began his legendary excavation of Ur. While his discovery of the royal cemetery and the treasures of Queen Puabi, which included the world's oldest surviving stringed instruments, known as the Silver Lyres, captured the public imagination, his most significant contribution was the meticulous mapping of the city's residential and sacred districts. His work provided the chronological framework for the early dynastic period and documented the evidence of human sacrifice. The Sumerians, the black-headed people, emerged from the mists of prehistory to lay the very foundation of human civilization. From the mud of the Fertile Crescent, they engineered the first cities, mastered the measurement of time, and pioneered the written word. Though their language eventually fell silent and their cities were buried by silt, their intellectual and spiritual legacy remains woven into the fabric of our daily lives. Every time we look at a clock or live under a system of laws, we are utilizing the tools of the Sumerians. Their story reminds us that progress is often born from the struggle to organize chaos into order. As we look toward our own future, we must wonder, which of our modern achievements will endure for 5,000 years, and which will be left for a distant generation to rediscover? Thank you for listening.